If you can't pay, then you can't sit here. The manager's voice cracked across the diner louder than the thunder outside. Every spoon stopped moving. Every eye turned toward the old man standing near the counter, rainwater dripping from the edge of his dark wool coat onto the black and white tile floor. Edward Langford didn't argue. That was the strange part. Most people would have defended themselves, gotten angry, embarrassed. But the old man simply lowered his eyes toward the steaming bowl of chicken soup in front of him and quietly reached into his coat pocket one more time, only to find nothing. His wallet was gone. "Sir, I already told you." The manager snapped, face red with irritation. "This isn't a shelter." Outside, freezing January rain hammered against the diner windows while the neon open sign buzzed weakly above the glass. Claire Whitmore stood frozen beside table 7, a tray balanced against one hip. 41 years old, exhausted from a double shift, and exactly $18 short of paying for her mother's heart medication. She should have stayed out of it. God knew she couldn't afford charity. But something about the old man bothered her. Not pity. No. Dignity. Even soaked to the bone. He sat straighter than half the businessmen who came into Rosie's diner wearing $1,000 suits. Claire noticed small things others missed. The polished shoes hidden beneath the rainwater. The silver watch peeking beneath his sleeve. The way his voice stayed calm while everyone else grew louder. "I said I'll leave," Edward said softly. "No need to cause a scene." A younger customer near the window laughed under his breath. "Guy probably does this every night." Another smirked without looking up from his phone. Claire felt her jaw tighten. Slowly, she walked toward the counter, untied the small knot in her apron pocket, and pulled out a folded $20 bill, the last cash she had until Friday. "Claire," the manager warned quietly. She ignored him. The bill landed softly beside the register. "The soup's covered." Silence. Not dramatic silence. Worse, the kind that makes people suddenly aware of themselves. Edward looked up at her for the first time. Pale gray eyes. Sharp despite his age. Observant. "Miss," he began carefully. "You don't have to do that." Claire grabbed the empty coffee pot beside her and shrugged. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I know." For a second, neither of them moved. Rain streaked down the windows behind him while warm yellow light wrapped around the steam rising from the soup bowl between them. The old man studied her face like he was trying to remember something important. Then he asked the question nobody in that diner expected. "Why would you spend your last $20 on a stranger?" Claire blinked once. "Because humiliation tastes worse than hunger." The room fell completely silent. And somewhere beyond the rain, beyond the neon lights and clinking dishes, something shifted behind the old man's tired eyes. Edward Langford stared at the bowl for several long seconds before finally lifting the spoon. His hands trembled slightly. Not from age alone, Claire realized, but exhaustion. Real exhaustion. The kind that settled deep into a person after too many sleepless nights and too many silent disappointments. Around them, the diner slowly returned to life. Forks clinked again. Coffee machines hissed. Someone near the jukebox laughed too loudly at something on television. But the tension never fully disappeared. Claire could still feel eyes following her as she moved between tables beneath the warm amber lights. "You should not have done that," muttered the manager when she passed the register again. "People take advantage of kindness." Claire grabbed 2 fresh mugs from the shelf without looking at him. "Maybe," she answered quietly. "But maybe some people just need one decent night." The manager exhaled sharply and walked away. Claire pretended not to notice the pharmacy receipt sticking halfway out of her apron pocket. She already knew the numbers by heart anyway. $118 for her mother's medication refill, due tomorrow morning. She had exactly $97 left after paying for the soup. $97. And 4 more hours before her shift ended. Across the diner, Edward slowly finished eating while snow mixed into the freezing rain outside. The weather had gotten worse. Wind rattled the windows hard enough to make the old neon sign flicker above the entrance. Claire refilled coffee for a truck driver near the counter when she noticed Edward watching her again. Not casually, carefully, like a man studying details everyone else overlooked. Finally, he stood and walked toward the register, buttoning his old coat with slow, deliberate movements. Up close, he smelled faintly of rainwater and cedar. Expensive cedar. Strange detail for someone who supposedly could not afford soup. "Miss Whitmore," he said softly. Claire blinked. "How do you know my name?" Edward glanced toward her name tag pinned crookedly against her cream-colored uniform. I still have decent eyesight. For the first time that night, Claire almost smiled. Almost. Edward reached into his coat pocket again. This time he pulled out a small silver fountain pen. Heavy, polished, old-fashioned. Definitely expensive. I would like to repay you someday, he said. Claire shook her head immediately. No, you do not owe me anything. That is where you are wrong. His voice remained calm, but something underneath it carried weight. Not authority exactly, something quieter. More dangerous. Certainty. Claire folded her arms against the cold draft sneaking through the door. Look, sir, it was just soup. Edward looked back toward the empty bowl sitting alone in the booth near the rain-covered window. No, he said quietly. It was dignity. The words settled into the silence between them. Then the diner door opened violently as another burst of icy wind swept inside. A man in a soaked delivery jacket rushed in carrying evening newspapers under one arm. Can you believe this? He shouted toward nobody in particular. Langford Holdings just bought another 6 buildings downtown today. Half the city belongs to that old billionaire now. Claire barely listened as she grabbed extra napkins from beneath the counter. But across from her, Edward Langford became very still. The delivery man slapped the wet newspaper onto the counter and laughed as he peeled snow from his gloves. I am telling you, Boston is becoming one giant Langford monopoly. Offices, hotels, apartments. The guy owns everything. Claire barely glanced up while wiping coffee rings from table 4. Her feet ached. Her shoulders burned from 12 straight hours carrying trays. Billionaires belong to another universe entirely, one with warm penthouses and drivers waiting outside, not broken neon signs and overdue pharmacy bills. But near the door, Edward Langford remained completely motionless. Not nervous, not surprised, just still. The kind of stillness powerful people carried when they were used to hearing their own names change the atmosphere in a room. Claire noticed it immediately. Her eyes narrowed slightly. You okay, sir? Edward slowly looked toward her again. The softness returned to his face almost instantly, like he had placed a mask back over something colder underneath. Quite all right, he answered calmly. The delivery man continued talking while pouring himself coffee near the register. My cousin works construction downtown. Says Langford Holdings bought 6 more buildings this morning. Nobody even sees the owner anymore. Some old ghost billionaire hiding behind lawyers and bodyguards. A few customers chuckled quietly. Edward said nothing. Claire picked up the newspaper absent-mindedly while passing the counter. There on the front page was a photograph of Boston's skyline beneath the headline. Langford Holdings expands downtown control. Beneath it stood several executives in dark coats outside a skyscraper, but the older man at the center had his face partially hidden by an umbrella. Still, something about the posture tugged at her memory. The straight shoulders. The silver hair. Before she could think further, the lights flickered overhead. Once. Twice. Then stabilized. The storm outside had become vicious now. Snow swirled violently beneath the streetlights, while freezing rain coated parked cars in glassy ice. Edward glanced toward the window. You should head home soon, he said quietly. Roads will become dangerous. Claire laughed softly under her breath while folding napkins. Home is a 40-minute bus ride and a leaking apartment ceiling. Dangerous is relative. Something shifted in Edward's expression at that. Regret maybe. Or recognition. You take care of someone, he observed carefully. Claire stopped folding. Just for half a second. My mother. Edward nodded slowly as though confirming a thought already forming in his mind. Then his eyes drifted toward the folded pharmacy receipt still peeking from her apron pocket. Heart medication? Claire instinctively covered the paper with her hand. You notice a lot for someone who forgot his wallet. For the first time that night. Edward smiled. Small. Genuine. Tired. And you trust strangers far too easily for someone living in this city. Their eyes held for a brief moment while thunder rolled somewhere over the harbor. Around them, Rosie's diner glowed warm against the storm like the last safe place in Boston. Then headlights suddenly flashed through the frozen windows outside. Bright. Expensive. Black SUVs rolled slowly past the diner one after another before disappearing into the storm. Edward watched them carefully without moving. Claire missed the look in his eyes completely, but the manager did not. And suddenly, the color drained from his face. The manager stared through the rain-covered window as the black SUVs disappeared into the storm one by one. His breathing changed first. Shorter. Uneasy. Claire noticed immediately. "What is wrong with you?" she asked quietly while stacking empty coffee cups beside the sink. He looked toward Edward, then quickly away again. Nothing. But it was not nothing. Claire had worked at Rosie's diner long enough to recognize fear when she saw it, especially in men who normally barked orders at everyone around them. The old fluorescent lights hummed overhead while midnight crept closer. Most customers had already left to outrun the worsening storm. Only a tired truck driver remained asleep in the back booth beneath the flickering television. Edward slowly adjusted his coat near the counter. Calm. Controlled. Almost elegant despite the soaked fabric and melting snow around his shoes. "I should leave before the roads close completely," he said softly. Claire glanced outside at the freezing rain hammering the empty streets. "You are not walking anywhere in that weather. I have managed worse. That is not the point." Her voice came out sharper than expected. Edward paused. Claire sighed quietly and rubbed her forehead. "Look, there is a 24-hour bus station 2 blocks away. At least stay there until morning." Edward studied her carefully again. "You worry about strangers often?" Claire laughed once without humor. "No. Usually, I barely have enough energy to worry about myself." For a moment, silence settled warmly between them while the coffee machines hissed behind the counter. Then the manager suddenly approached, lowering his voice almost to a whisper. "Sir, I apologize if earlier there was any misunderstanding." Claire blinked in confusion. 3 hours ago, the same man had practically thrown Edward toward the door. Now he looked ready to polish the old man's shoes. Edward noticed it too. "No misunderstanding," he answered calmly. "Your employee showed more character than your establishment." The words landed softly, but they hit harder than shouting. The manager swallowed visibly. Claire stared between them both, increasingly confused. "Okay," she finally muttered. "What exactly is happening here?" Nobody answered immediately. Outside, thunder rolled across the Boston skyline, while blue emergency lights flashed faintly several streets away. Snow now coated the sidewalks in thick icy layers. Edward reached into his coat pocket again and carefully removed a small business card. Plain black. No logo. No decoration. Just a silver phone number embossed across the center. He slid it gently toward Claire. "If life becomes difficult," he said quietly, "call that number." Claire frowned immediately. "I am not taking money from you. I did not offer money." "Then what is it?" Edward's pale gray eyes softened slightly beneath the diner lights. "A door," he answered. Before Claire could respond, the front entrance suddenly burst open under a violent gust of freezing wind. A tall man in a dark tailored coat rushed inside, snow covering his shoulders. His eyes scanned the diner once, then locked instantly onto Edward. Relief flooded across his face. "Mr. Langford," he breathed. "We have been searching for you for 4 hours." The entire diner went silent, and Claire Whitmore finally felt the first cold wave of realization crawl slowly down her spine. Claire stared at the man standing in the doorway while icy wind swept through the diner behind him. Tall, mid-50s, expensive charcoal overcoat dusted with snow. The kind of man who belonged inside glass towers, not inside Rosie's diner at midnight. But what froze her completely was not the man himself. It was the way he looked at Edward. Respect. Immediate. Absolute. "Mr. Langford," the newcomer repeated, breathing hard. "Your security team has shut down half of downtown looking for you." The manager nearly dropped the coffee mug. Claire slowly turned toward Edward again. The old man looked mildly inconvenienced, nothing more. "I turned my phone off," he said calmly. Clearly, the newcomer stepped closer, lowering his voice. "The board meeting was delayed 3 hours. Investors are panicking, and your daughter has called 12 times. Edward sighed softly like a tired father being scolded after missing dinner. "Thomas, the city survived without me for 1 evening." Thomas. Claire mentally repeated the name while her pulse quietly accelerated. Something cold settled deep in her stomach. She looked back toward the newspaper still lying on the counter. Langford Holdings. Half the city. Suddenly, every strange detail from the night came rushing back at once. The watch. The posture. The black business card. The SUVs outside. Her fingers tightened around the coffee pot handle. "Wait," she whispered. Thomas noticed her then. "You must be the waitress." Edward answered before Claire could speak. Her name is Claire. The correction was soft, but immediate. Thomas glanced between them carefully, confusion flickering across his face. Sir, the cars are ready whenever you are. Edward nodded once, but did not move. Instead, he looked toward Claire again beneath the warm hanging lights of the nearly empty diner. You paid for my dinner tonight, he said quietly. Claire let out a nervous laugh. I think I accidentally undercharged a billionaire. To her surprise, Edward smiled. A real smile this time. Brief. Human. Most people overcharge me the second they learn my name. Silence settled around them while snow rattled violently against the windows. The manager suddenly stepped forward with an awkward, forced grin Claire had never seen before. Mr. Langford, sir, if we had known who you were, your meal would have been complimentary. Edward's expression changed instantly. Not angry. Worse. Disappointed. That, he said softly, is precisely the problem. The manager's smile collapsed. Edward slowly reached for his old coat, while Thomas moved to open the diner door. Outside, black SUVs waited beneath glowing streetlights like silent shadows in the storm. But before leaving, Edward paused beside Claire one last time. Up close, she could now see the exhaustion behind his pale gray eyes. Not weakness, loneliness. The kind money never fixed. You treated me kindly when you believed I had nothing, he said quietly. Do not lose that. Claire opened her mouth to answer, but no words came. Edward placed something gently beside the register before turning away. Then he disappeared into the freezing Boston night, surrounded by security and black umbrellas, while the diner stood completely silent behind him. Only after the SUVs vanished into the storm did Claire finally look down at the counter. Her breath caught instantly. Sitting beside the register was the old silver fountain pen, and underneath it, a folded property document with Rosie's Diner's address typed across the top. Claire picked up the folded document with trembling fingers while the storm roared outside like a freight train. The diner had gone completely silent now, except for the low electric hum of the refrigerators behind the counter. Even the manager stood frozen beside the register, staring at the paper in her hands as though it might explode. Open it, he whispered. Claire swallowed hard and unfolded the document slowly beneath the yellow hanging lights. At first, the legal language blurred together. Property transfer. Commercial ownership. Pending acquisition. Then her eyes stopped on one line near the bottom. Current property status. Under review by Langford Holdings. Claire's stomach dropped. What does that mean? She asked quietly. The manager suddenly looked sick. Actually sick. Sweat glistened along his forehead despite the cold diner air. It means, he hesitated. It means this building was sold last week. Claire looked up sharply. Sold to who? But deep down, she already knew. The answer arrived in silence before the words ever came. Langford Holdings, the manager admitted. Thunder shook the windows hard enough to rattle silverware across the counter. Claire stared at the document again while her pulse hammered in her ears. You mean, your billionaire soup customer owns this diner now, the manager finished weakly. For several seconds, Claire could not speak at all. Her exhausted brain tried piecing together the entire night again from the beginning. The old coat, the missing wallet, the lonely eyes, the strange business card. Slowly, another realization crawled into her chest. Edward had known exactly where he was the entire time. He had walked into a diner he already owned. Why would someone like him even come here? Claire whispered. The manager laughed nervously without humor. People like him do strange things. But Claire shook her head immediately. No, this had not felt random. Nothing about Edward Langford felt random. She looked down at the silver fountain pen still resting beside the paperwork. Expensive. Heavy. Engraved with tiny initials near the clip. Yell, Claire, the manager said carefully, lowering his voice. You should probably call that number. She looked up slowly. Why? Because if Langford Holdings decides to shut this place down. He glanced around the aging diner with visible dread. Every single one of us loses our jobs. The words hit hard. Too hard. Claire suddenly pictured her mother sitting alone in their tiny apartment waiting for medication Claire could barely afford already. She imagined eviction notices. Hospital bills. Another dead-end job with another exhausted smile pasted across her face. Her fingers tightened around the black business card Edward had given her earlier. A door. That was what he called it. Outside, snow now buried the sidewalks in thick white layers while the City lights glowed pale through the storm. Rosie's diner felt smaller than ever suddenly. Fragile. Temporary. The manager rubbed both hands through his thinning hair. I spent 3 years trying to get investors to even notice this place, he muttered bitterly. You bought one bowl of soup and somehow caught the attention of the richest man in Boston. Claire let out a quiet breath and stared toward the empty booth where Edward had sat earlier that night. The soup bowl was still there, one spoon resting carefully beside it. Somehow, that lonely little booth now felt more important than every luxury office tower downtown. Claire barely slept that night. The storm kept hammering against her apartment windows until nearly dawn while old heating pipes rattled through the walls like distant footsteps. She sat alone at the tiny kitchen table wearing an oversized gray sweater, staring at the black business card beside a cold cup of coffee. Her mother slept quietly in the next room beneath 2 blankets and the soft blue glow of an oxygen machine. Normally, Claire could ignore exhaustion, bills, fear. She had trained herself to survive one shift at a time. But this felt different, dangerous in a way she could not explain. Outside, pale morning light slowly spread across Boston under fresh snow. The city looked softer after storms, cleaner, like it had hidden all its problems beneath white silence for one more day. Claire finally stood, tucked the card into her coat pocket, and headed back to Rosie's diner for her morning shift. The moment she turned onto the block, she stopped walking. 3 black luxury SUVs sat parked outside the diner beneath the icy morning sun. Men in dark wool coats stood near the entrance, speaking quietly into earpieces. Customers gathered across the street, pretending not to stare. Claire's stomach tightened instantly. One of the suited men noticed her approaching. Miss Whitmore. She froze. Yes. The man stepped aside immediately and opened the diner door for her. Respectful. Professional. Like she mattered suddenly. That alone frightened her more than anything else. Inside, Rosie's diner looked completely different. Fresh flowers sat on the counter. The flickering light above booth 6 had been replaced overnight. Someone had even repaired the broken jukebox near the bathrooms. Claire turned slowly in confusion. What is all this? The manager hurried toward her looking more nervous than she had ever seen him. He has been here since 6 this morning. Claire's heartbeat stumbled once. Who? But she already knew. Near the back booth by the snowy window, Edward Langford sat quietly reading the Boston Globe while sunlight reflected softly across his silver hair. Except now, there was nothing hidden about him. Tailored charcoal suit, crisp white shirt, silver tie. A watch worth more than Claire's yearly salary glimmered beneath his cuff. Yet somehow, he still looked exactly the same. Calm, tired, lonely. Edward folded the newspaper carefully when he saw her. Good morning, Claire. Her throat suddenly felt dry. You came back. One corner of his mouth lifted slightly. I own the building. It would be strange if I did not. A few nearby customers laughed nervously. Claire did not. She slowly approached the booth while every employee in the diner secretly watched them. What is this? She asked quietly. Why are all these people here? Edward glanced around the diner once before answering. Because powerful men panic when they lose track of me for several hours. Claire folded her arms tightly. And what do you want from me exactly? The warmth faded slightly from Edward's expression then. Not anger. Something sadder. Nothing, he answered softly. That is precisely why you interest me. Silence settled between them while snow drifted slowly outside the window. Then Edward reached into his inside jacket pocket and placed a thick cream-colored envelope gently onto the table between them. Claire stared at it without touching it. What is that? Edward's pale gray eyes met hers steadily. A choice. Claire stared at the cream-colored envelope sitting between them while morning customers whispered quietly from nearby booths. Outside, sunlight reflected across fresh snowbanks and black SUV windows, turning the entire street silver. Everything felt unreal. 24 hours earlier, she had been counting. Quarters for bus fare. Now the most powerful man in Boston sat across from her offering something wrapped in thick, expensive paper. I am not signing anything, she said carefully. Edward nodded once. Good. People should never sign documents they do not understand. His calmness unsettled her more than arrogance would have. Claire slowly picked up the envelope. Heavy. Inside was a stack of papers and a small brass key attached to a plain white tag. She frowned immediately. What is this? Edward folded his hands together atop the table. Read page 3. Claire flipped through the documents while the manager hovered nearby, pretending to wipe menus. Her eyes moved quickly over legal language she barely understood until suddenly one line stopped her cold. Transfer of operational ownership. She blinked once, twice, then looked up sharply. No, Edward said nothing. Claire pushed the papers back across the table immediately. Absolutely not. Several employees nearby exchanged nervous glances. Edward remained perfectly still. You have not finished reading. I do not need to. Her voice cracked louder than intended. I bought you soup. That does not mean you get to change my entire life. Something flickered behind Edward's eyes then. Respect, perhaps. Most people would already be asking how much money comes with the offer. Claire laughed softly in disbelief. Most people probably are not drowning already. Silence settled heavily over the diner. Edward glanced toward the snowy street outside before speaking again. 3 years ago, he said quietly, my wife died in this city. The room seemed to shrink slightly around his words. Even the manager stopped moving completely. Edward's pale gray eyes remained fixed on the steam rising from his untouched coffee cup. After that, everyone treated me carefully. Politicians, lawyers, executives. They all became very kind. A faint bitter smile crossed his face. Not because they cared, because they feared losing access to my money. Claire listened without interrupting. So occasionally, Edward continued softly, I disappear for a night. No assistance, no security, no name. And I watch how people behave when they think power is absent. Claire looked down slowly at the ownership papers again. That is insane. Perhaps. Edward nodded slightly. But loneliness makes people do unusual things. The honesty in his voice caught her off guard completely. This was not a billionaire performing generosity for attention. This sounded like a tired man searching desperately for something real. Edward gently slid the brass key closer to her. Rosie's diner loses money every year, he admitted. My advisors wanted me to replace it with luxury retail space. The manager's face drained of color again. But then I watched a woman with overdue medical bills spend her last $20 protecting the dignity of a stranger. Claire felt heat rise behind her eyes instantly. Edward's voice softened almost to a whisper. Kindness like that should not disappear from this city. For several seconds, she could not speak at all. Outside, snow drifted quietly beneath the pale winter sun, while customers throughout the diner watched in complete silence. Then Claire finally asked the one question that mattered most. Why me? Edward looked at her steadily. Because you saw a human being before you saw a bank account. Claire looked at the brass key resting in her palm, while sunlight spilled softly across the diner windows. For the first time in years, she did not know what to say. Around her, coffee machines hummed quietly. Plates clinked. Snow melted slowly along the edges of parked cars outside. Life kept moving, but something inside her had stopped completely. I cannot take this, she whispered finally. Edward Langford leaned back slightly in the booth, studying her with calm, patient eyes. You already did. Claire shook her head immediately. No, I paid for soup. That is not the same thing as owning a business. You misunderstand me. Edward's voice remained gentle. I am not rewarding you for soup. He glanced around Rosie's diner slowly. The cracked leather booths. The faded menus. The tired workers pretending not to listen. I am rewarding you for remaining kind in a city that profits from cold people. Silence settled heavily between them. Claire looked down at the ownership papers. Again, while emotions tangled painfully in her chest. Fear, exhaustion, hope. She had spent years surviving one paycheck at a time. Years apologizing for bills she could not pay. Years shrinking herself smaller and smaller just to survive another week. And now suddenly, someone was handing her a future she never allowed herself to imagine. Why would you trust me with this place? She asked softly. Edward smiled faintly. Because you protected someone when there was nothing to gain from it. His eyes drifted toward the snowy street outside. That is rarer than intelligence. Rarer than ambition. Especially among powerful people. Claire felt tears sting her eyes unexpectedly. Not dramatic tears. Quiet ones. The dangerous kind that arrive after years of carrying too much alone. Edward noticed immediately, but politely looked away. My wife loved diners like this, he said after a moment. She believed people revealed their true selves over simple food. His expression softened beneath the morning light. I think she would have liked you very much. Claire pressed her lips together, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice. Nearby, the manager quietly removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes as though embarrassed to witness the moment. Outside, children laughed while throwing snowballs down the sidewalk. Boston had fully awakened now. Bright, cold, alive. Claire finally picked up the brass key again. Heavy, real. If I say yes, she asked carefully, what happens now? Edward stood slowly from the booth, adjusting his silver tie beneath the warm diner lights. Now, a small tired smile crossed his face. Now you stop surviving and start building something. Then, before anyone expected it, Edward reached for his coat and headed toward the door alone. No dramatic speech, no cameras, just a quiet old man stepping back into the snow-covered city he secretly owned. Claire watched him disappear into the winter sunlight while the brass key rested warmly in her hand. And somehow, Rosie's diner no longer felt small anymore. Sometimes one bowl of soup changes nothing, and sometimes it changes everything. If this story touched your heart, tell us what you would have done in Claire's place, and whether you still believe kindness matters in a world that often rewards power more than compassion.